Somewhere right now, someone is standing in line, phone in hand, waiting to pay almost $7 for a cup of coffee. They don't complain, they just pay, and they don't even ask why. But here's the strange part. 10 years ago, that same cup cost half as much. The beans haven't changed, the cup hasn't gotten bigger. So where did all that extra money go? The answer isn't just inflation. It's a story that stretches from a drought-cracked field in Brazil to a shipping container stuck in traffic on the other side of the planet. It involves frost, war, speculation, and a tiny insect that can wipe out an entire harvest overnight. This is the strange, hidden economics of your morning coffee. And once you understand it, you'll never look at that cup the same way again. Let's start with a number that sounds almost unbelievable. In the early 2020s, a pound of coffee traded for around $1.20 on international markets. Today, that same pound can cost $4 or more. That's not a small bump. That's a price increase of more than 300% in just a few years. To put that in perspective, imagine if a loaf of bread that cost $3 suddenly cost $12. People would be furious. They'd demand answers. But with coffee, the price crept up slowly enough, cup by cup, that most people barely noticed until they looked at their monthly spending. So what actually happened? The story begins not in a boardroom but on a hillside. Coffee is one of the most fragile crops on Earth. It doesn't grow just anywhere. It needs a very specific temperature range, consistent rainfall, and rich volcanic soil found in only a narrow band of countries near the equator. There are two main types of coffee beans that matter here. Arabica, the smoother, more expensive variety, grows best in cool, high-altitude regions like the mountains of Brazil, Colombia, and Ethiopia. Robusta, the hardier, more bitter bean, often used in instant coffee and espresso blends, is grown in lower, hotter regions like Vietnam. For decades, this system worked. Farmers knew their seasons. Buyers knew their prices. The whole global coffee trade moved like a well-rehearsed dance. Then the climate started changing the rhythm. Brazil produces roughly 1 out of every 3 cups of coffee in the world. It is, by a wide margin, the single most important country in the entire global coffee supply chain. When something goes wrong in Brazil, the whole world feels it. And in recent years, something has gone very wrong. Severe droughts have hit Brazil's coffee-growing regions again and again, drying out the soil that coffee trees depend on. Less water means smaller beans, weaker harvests, and in some cases, entire fields that simply fail to produce. Coffee trees are strangely unforgiving. Unlike wheat or corn, you can't just replant them next season and expect a normal harvest. A coffee tree takes 3 to 4 years to mature enough to produce fruit. So if a drought damages young trees today, the effects on supply can linger for years afterward. Now picture the opposite problem. Too much heat, sustained for too long, does something almost as damaging as drought. Research shows that temperatures consistently above 30 degrees Celsius are harmful to Arabica trees, and even Robusta, the tougher variety, starts to struggle in that kind of heat. As global temperatures rise, more and more of the traditional coffee belt is crossing that dangerous threshold. Farmers are being forced to move their crops higher up mountains, chasing cooler air. But mountains only go so high, and land at higher altitudes is limited, harder to farm, and more expensive to maintain. This is the quiet, terrifying math of climate change in the coffee industry. The land where good coffee can grow is shrinking, while the demand for coffee around the world keeps climbing. But climate isn't the only villain in this story. There's a second character, and it's just as important, if less visible: geopolitics. Vietnam is the world's largest producer of Robusta coffee, supplying much of the bean used in instant coffee and many espresso blends across Europe and Asia. When Vietnam has a bad harvest, or when its farmers simply hold onto their stock waiting for better prices, the ripple effect hits coffee drinkers thousands of miles away. In recent years, Vietnamese coffee farmers have done exactly that. Faced with uncertain harvests and rising costs, many chose to sell only small amounts of their stock, just enough to cover daily expenses, while holding on to the rest. It's a rational decision for an individual farmer. But multiplied across an entire country, it tightens global supply even further. Then there's the tangled web of tariffs and trade policy. Coffee doesn't just grow and get sold. It crosses borders, sometimes several of them, before it ever reaches a roaster. Every added tariff, every new trade restriction, adds a small tax that eventually lands in your cup. Shipping costs matter too, more than most people realize. When global shipping lanes get disrupted, whether by conflict, canal blockages, or fuel price spikes, the cost of simply moving coffee beans from a farm to a port to a roasting facility climbs. And that cost doesn't disappear. It gets passed down the chain until it reaches the customer holding the cup. So now we have drought shrinking the harvest, heat pushing farms to the edges of survivable land, farmers hoarding stock out of caution, and shipping costs rising on top of all of it. But there's one more piece of this puzzle, and it might be the strangest one of all. Coffee isn't just a crop, it's also a financial product. On major exchanges in New York and London, coffee is traded as a commodity, almost like gold or oil. Investors buy and sell coffee futures, contracts that bet on what the price will be months from now without ever touching a single bean. This means coffee prices aren't only driven by how much coffee actually exists in the world. They're also driven by fear, speculation, and expectation. If traders believe a drought in Brazil will get worse, prices can spike today, even before the actual harvest is affected. This is where things get almost surreal. A rumor about weather in a Brazilian valley can cause a price jump on a screen in Manhattan within minutes. Coffee has become, in a strange way, a bet on the future of the climate itself. And once prices start rising sharply, something called backwardation can happen in the futures market, meaning contracts for coffee delivered soon become more expensive than contracts for coffee delivered later. It's the market's way of saying, we're worried about right now. All of this volatility eventually flows downstream, from the trading floor to the roaster, from the roaster to the cafe, and finally to you, standing in line with your wallet out. Let's follow that journey more closely, because it explains something that puzzles a lot of coffee drinkers. Why does a $2 jump in the price of raw coffee beans somehow turn into a much bigger jump in the price of your latte? The answer lies in how coffee shops actually make their money. The raw beans themselves are often a surprisingly small part of the final price you pay. Rent, wages, electricity, milk, cups, marketing, all of these costs are baked into that $6 or $7 price tag. But here's the twist. When the cost of raw coffee doubles or triples, cafes can't just quietly absorb it, because coffee beans are usually their single largest variable cost. Many roasters and wholesalers add their own margin on top, meaning a price increase at the farm level gets amplified by the time it reaches the retail shelf or the coffee shop counter. Some coffee businesses have started fighting back against this cycle in a clever way, by roasting their own beans in-house instead of buying from wholesale roasters. Wholesale roasting can take a large chunk of the potential profit margin on every single pound of coffee. Cutting out that middle step lets some shops protect themselves a little from the chaos happening at the global level. Still, for most of us, none of that changes what we see on the menu board. Prices go up, and they rarely come back down to where they started. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If coffee keeps getting more expensive, why do we keep buying it? Economists have a term for this kind of product: inelastic demand. It means that even when the price rises significantly, people don't cut back nearly as much as basic math would predict. Coffee isn't just a drink. For hundreds of millions of people, it's a ritual, a routine, sometimes even an identity. Global coffee consumption hasn't collapsed under rising prices. It has actually continued growing, especially as demand expands in countries across Asia where coffee culture is relatively new but rapidly spreading. More people want coffee today than ever before in human history, even as the planet makes it harder to grow. This creates a strange kind of tension at the heart of the whole industry. Supply is becoming less reliable because of climate stress, while demand keeps climbing because of population growth and shifting culture. When supply struggles to keep up with demand, price is often the thing that has to adjust. So is this just a temporary storm, Or is it something more permanent? Market analysts studying this question have started using a phrase that should catch your attention: the new normal. Some price relief is expected in the coming years as farms recover and new crops mature, particularly in Brazil, where production is projected to increase again as replanted trees finally reach maturity. But even with that recovery, experts largely agree that prices are unlikely to fall back to where they were a decade ago. The reason is structural, not just cyclical. Climate change isn't a single bad season that will pass. It's a long, slow shift in the actual geography of where coffee can grow at all. And that kind of change doesn't reverse itself once the trade tensions ease or the shipping lanes clear up. This means the coffee industry is entering uncharted territory. Farmers are experimenting with heat-resistant coffee varieties. Companies are investing in direct relationships with growers, hoping to secure stable supply chains in an unstable world. Some are even exploring lab-grown or alternative coffee compounds, though none of that has replaced the real thing yet, not even close. Let's zoom out for a second because this story is bigger than just coffee. It's really a story about what happens when a fragile natural resource collides with a hungry, growing global market. We've seen this pattern before with other commodities. Cocoa prices spiked dramatically after poor harvests in West Africa. Olive oil prices surged after droughts hit the Mediterranean. Coffee is just the latest and maybe the most visible example of a much larger pattern. These are what some economists call climate-sensitive commodities, products whose entire existence depends on a narrow, fragile set of environmental conditions. As the planet's climate becomes less predictable, more and more of the things we take for granted on grocery shelves may start behaving the same way. And that brings us back to that person standing in line, about to pay $7 for their coffee. They're not just paying for roasted beans, hot water, and a paper cup. They're paying for a drought in Brazil. They're paying for a shipping delay somewhere in the Pacific. They're paying for a trader's nervous bet in a New York office tower. They're paying, whether they realize it or not, for the slow, quiet reshaping of the planet's climate. It's easy to think of a coffee price as just a number on a menu. But every number tells a story, if you're willing to trace it back far enough. And the story of coffee is really the story of how connected and how fragile our global systems have become. So the next time you order your coffee, maybe you'll pause for just a second before handing over your card. Maybe you'll think about the mountain slope in Brazil, or the farmer in Vietnam deciding whether to sell today or wait, or the trader watching weather reports thousands of miles from any coffee farm. Coffee connects all of us in ways most people never stop to consider. It's proof that even the smallest, most ordinary parts of our daily lives are shaped by forces far bigger than ourselves. And that's exactly the kind of hidden economic story this channel loves to uncover. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers behind something as simple as a cup of coffee, imagine what other everyday things are hiding stories just as strange. Subscribe to The Economics of Weird Things, because the world is full of prices that don't make sense until you know the whole story. And trust me, once you start noticing them, you won't be able to stop.